All right, fire up A-Push Scholars, Mr. Beamer here. Time for another test review video. This is chapters 15 through 17. A little bit of historical context. I am doing this video the day after the 2016 election. It's November 9, 2016, and Donald Trump has just defeated Hillary Clinton. So, wow, how about that? All right, so this test is going to be over economic and social developments in antebellum America. We know that antebellum America is the time before the Civil War. And so these three chapters discuss economic and social changes. There's a little bit of political stuff, but mostly that's from chapters 11 through 14. So let's get started looking at chapter 15 first. All right, I kind of lied. Before we get to chapter 15, let's just look at our three chapters, the names of each chapter and what the main topics are. So the first one will be chapter 15, the U.S. market economy, and this, again, develops in antebellum America. And I have the years 1793 to 1860 or 1815 to 1860. Okay, the reason why I have 1793, I think that year should stand out to you. Washington was president, but that really, in this situation, is not really that important. That is the invention of the you know what it is, the cotton gin. Okay, 1793, and that really kind of triggers our market economy, leads us into industrialization. But you could also argue maybe that the market economy develops in the year 1815. And in some historical context there, that is the end or the last year of the War of 1812. And that's the year that the United States truly begins to become a recognized world power, and our industry really probably booms mostly after 1815. In 1816, we passed the tariff of 1816, which protects manufacturing and kind of booms our industry. So again, it's basically, again, the early 1800s is when we developed this market economy. Chapter 16 is going to be on religion and reforms in antebellum America. And whenever we see religion in antebellum America, we've got to think of the Second Great Awakening. That is a major event in terms of religion. And that religious revival drives these reform movements during this time period, and we'll get to that in chapter 16. And the final chapter is chapter 17. Oops, I wanted to go back one thing. I have the years 1820 to 1860. And again, 1820 is kind of the beginning of the Second Great Awakening. There's not a specific year that this religious revival begins. Maybe the height of the Second Great Awakening was like in the 1830s and into the 1840s. But again, it's just a generalized time period of that. And the final chapter then is chapter 17, the South and slavery. And there's that year 1793. The cotton gin booms the slave trade and the need for slaves because the South is dependent on cotton. Cotton is the king and controls the southern economy up until antebellum America, and we'll get into that. Let's begin with chapter 15, the U.S. market economy. I already mentioned these years. Again, our economy really becomes dependent upon trade. Okay, that's kind of what the market economy is all about, trade. And so now farmers are now growing their crops not just to survive, which is called subsistence farming. They are now growing crops to trade and to earn an income. And so this chapter is about that. And so we'll begin, first of all, with early immigration. And again, in order to a market economy to thrive, you need workers. And the two main immigrant groups of this time period are the Irish and the Germans. So you know the specifics of each. We'll start with the Irish. The Irish came over mostly because of the potato famine, starvation of millions of Irish because of lack of food, and so many of them came over around the 1840s and 1850s. Where did they settle? Mostly Irish settled in the northeastern part of the United States, especially in the cities along the coast. Okay, so it boomed the population of cities, especially cities like Boston and New York City. Some characteristics of the Irish, one of the biggest ones is their religion. The Irish are pretty much all Catholic. Okay, and so this is kind of a problem for some Americans because many Americans at this time are Protestant, and there's a big religious conflict between the Irish Catholics and the Protestant Americans. And lastly, about the Irish, most of the Irish worked in factories, which helped cause the rise of industrialization in these major cities. So there were low-paying, unskilled factory jobs. All right, let's talk about the Germans now. So the Germans moved out to the west. And when we say the west, we're not talking about California. We're talking about the Midwest, mostly in the state of Wisconsin and surrounding areas. They were in the late 1840s into the 1850s. The Germans, they religiously were more of a split between Irish and Protestant for the Germans. Also, the Germans became farmers when they moved out west, and there was less conflict between nativist Americans and the Germans because they were out west and just basically farming. All right, I did mention the term nativism. That's a must-know in APUSH. And nativism is the fear of foreigners, and so it was a big reaction to these immigrants coming to America and antebellum America, and it developed partly into a political party called the Know Nothing Party. And this party came about in the 1850s, and it was a reaction against the Irish and the Germans, specifically against the Irish, mostly because the Irish were in the cities. This is where a lot of this native reaction came. Some of the biggest problems the nativists had was the religion of the Irish. Again, most of the Americans of the 1840s and 1850s were Protestant, and they did not like the Irish Catholics as much. So there definitely was an issue with that. All right, let's get into the Industrial Revolution. It begins around the year 1800. Again, when I think of the Industrial Revolution, I think of the growth of factories, the growth of cities, especially in the Northeast, in New England and New York is really where this industry booms. And especially in New England, a lot of these factories create textiles. And when we think of the textile industry, you got to think of Lowell, Massachusetts, and the Mill Girls. That was probably the biggest manufacturing in the United States and antebellum America. And the cotton gin definitely boomed our Industrial Revolution because of this cotton. We can get a lot more cotton, and it's cheaper, and we can use it in our factories. And we should probably also know that the cotton gin was invented by Eli Whitney. I think that name is important. And the biggest effect of the cotton gin is it definitely increased the demand for slavery. So slavery continued in the United States and became more important, and slaves were needed more to help pick the cotton. Besides the Industrial Revolution, another revolution is in transportation. Begins around the year, I have the year 1807. Make a connection to 1807, maybe you think of Robert Fulton and his invention, which was the steamboat. Okay, and so the steamboat begins in 1807. This is an important invention for transportation because now it allows ships to go upstream. Before, the only direction ships could go is downstream, but now that it's a two-way artery, and so that's such a huge invention in 1807. Besides the steamboat, when I think of the transportation revolution, I think of internal improvements. I think of roads and canals. And roads and canals is very important. They connected people and goods east and west. So the roads, canals, and even most of the railroads went east and west to connect the east with the west. Okay, so I think that's important to know. For the South, the main transportation was the steamboat and the Mississippi River, but these roads and canals started to bind our country together. Okay, and the Erie Canal is probably the most important of the canals because it made New York City the #1 port, and so that's how a lot of the goods were shipped on the Great Lakes. And then they went on the Erie Canal, came down the Hudson River, and then they came through New York City. And so the transportation revolution really developed our market economy, and it kind of made each region specialize in what they did. We know that the South was mostly king cotton. The West was mostly farming grains and producing livestock. And of course, the Northeast or the North was manufacturing. And so this transportation bound these areas together much easier. And the last major invention for transportation was the railroad that came about in 1828. Most of the railroads we should know were in the North. There was very few railroads in the South. So the railroads and the canals connected the North with the West. And then the West was connected to the South with the steamboat because the steamboat could now go upstream, especially up the Mississippi River. Last couple things, the agricultural revolution. Again, we had a couple of major inventions that increased the amount of production of our crops. The biggest two were the mechanical reaper, created by Cyrus McCormick, and that allowed for much easier of harvesting crops, especially wheat and grains. And the other one was the steel plow by John Deere, 1837, made plowing much easier. And the final thing I want to mention in Chapter 15 was the idea of the code of domesticity. You should know that one about the women, their role is to stay at home, and a lot like Republican motherhood in that way. However, there was beginning to be a reaction against the code of domesticity. Some women wanted more. They wanted more choice. They wanted more rights, which eventually is going to lead to the Seneca Falls Convention for Women's Rights in 1848. All right, let's do a quick review of Chapter 16, Religion and Reform, Antebellum America. The first major event is the Second Great Awakening, the rise of religion and emotion in the United States. Mostly in the 1820s through 1840s is kind of when this religious revival begins. The biggest cause was the reaction to the deists. Again, deists are not Christians. They believe in a God, but they're not very religious, and so a lot of Americans had a problem with that, and so they became more emotion, more fired up for religion. Charles Granderson Finney is the leading preacher of the Second Great Awakening. An example of this movement was the camp meetings. There'd be 25,000 people getting fired up for God at these meetings all across the United States. Okay, one thing it did do, though, this movement did cause a split between classes and especially regions. Okay, especially some like the Baptists were divided in between Northern and Southern Baptists. There was a little bit of a split in some of the denominations. One of the biggest issues, of course, was the slavery issue caused this split in some of the denominations between North and South. Another huge result of the Second Great Awakening, maybe the biggest one, though, is the growth of reform movements out of that. A lot of these people who were big into this religious revival said we need to change America, we need to make it better, and so they developed some of these movements, education, prison, and so on, to make America better. First thing you need to know is that a lot of these reformers were women. Okay, a lot of these reformers were women. Some of them were not fans of the code of domesticity, wanted more out of their life, and so they got involved trying to change America and make it better. Take a look at some of these movements. Firstly, education. The founder of public schools is Horace Mann, and he believed, and many Americans believed, that public schools were necessary to make our country to flourish, democracy, to make it stable, and so there's a lot of value in early public education for all American children. Okay, prison reform, Dorothea Dix, need to know her, the terrible conditions for the prisoners during this time period, so she made people know about that. Of course, we'll talk about the women's movement a little bit more when we get to Seneca Falls. Temperance, okay, this movement was trying to end drunkenness. Maybe you can make a connection to why temperance movement becomes important in the 1840s, 1850s. Partly maybe a reaction to all the Irish immigrants as well, but there was a movement to end alcohol in the United States. And the last biggest and most influential of the reform movements was abolition. Many of these people wanted to end slavery. And again, many of these reformers, for all of them, were women in this time period. All right, quick note about utopian communities. Again, these were communities, and so these were groups of people that were out a lot of times in the middle of nowhere together, trying to form a community, trying to have a relationship. And they wanted to get away from the problems of industrialization. So the two that I like to focus on are the Oneida community and the Shakers. The Oneida, wow, fire up for them. They're about free love, and they're a very open society in the state of New York. Okay, so that's a utopian community out in their own little world, trying to make their special little place. Another relatively odd one are the Shakers. Again, another utopian community to make it this perfect place, and they believe the complete division between women and men, so no relations with each other, and the only way they could grow as a community was through immigration, bringing people into their community. So very unusual utopian societies developed in antebellum America. A little bit about art in antebellum America. The biggest thing about art, is the Hudson River School. Some of these early artists were big into painting landscapes, so beautiful portraits showing the beauty of the United States. All right, more reforms, antebellum America. Let's talk about the Transcendentalists, okay? And these were a bunch of writers. The big three Transcendentalists you need to know are Whitman, Thoreau, and Ralph Waldo Emerson. And their biggest ideas were about individualism and being out in nature and trying to find an inner truth, trying to feel God's presence in their life. And they also were a reaction to the industrialization of the time period. And they were about, you're on your own, and so they wanted to get away from people, and they were some of the most famous writers in American history were the Transcendentalists. Okay, lastly, Seneca Falls, 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention. The women there wrote the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions demanding women's rights, the right to vote, and other equalities in the United States. Some of the leaders that we should probably know, we've got the Grimke sisters, we've got Susan B. Anthony, we've got Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott. So there's some names that you should probably make connections with the women's movement. Chapter 17, the South and slavery. 1793 to 1860, we see 1793, we think of the cotton gin and how that really increased slavery in the United States. And so that's why it's such an important invention in our history, unfortunately. Okay, the Southern social classes. On the top, we have the planters. And then we've got other white slave owners, and then the non-slave owning whites, and so on. So you need to know, really study that. A couple of points to make is that the planters had most of the slaves in the South, You need to know some percentages. Okay, what percent of Southerners did not own slaves? 75% of whites in the South did not own slaves. Okay, but yet they did seem to support slavery. I think that's important to know. Okay, and then why partly did only a quarter of them own slaves? Why didn't more? Well, a big reason why is that there was a cost. Okay, and the slave trade really starts to increase during the antebellum America, and the value of slaves increased because they were seen as property. And so most Southern whites could not afford their slaves. Another group I wanted to mention were the mountain whites. These mountain whites were Southerners that lived mostly in the Appalachian regions, if we think of the hills of Tennessee, North Carolina, and so on. And a lot of these mountain whites did not like blacks or the slaves, but they also did not like the planters. Okay, and these are the ones that during the Civil War, actually some of them support the Union still during the Civil War, and the most famous mountain white is eventually President Andrew Johnson. And he becomes president after Lincoln's assassination. Okay, next, free blacks in the North. Okay, we know that there was, you should know, there's about 250,000 free blacks in the North and in the South. And in the South, the free blacks were just above the slaves in the social class standing. There's always fear of the Southern free black that they would be actually put back into slavery, or could be put back into slavery. But in the North, though, free blacks did face many struggles as well. The Irish and the free blacks did not get along well. A lot of conflict there between the groups. And a lot of free blacks faced discrimination in the North. So even though they were not slaves, there was a lot of conflict between the free blacks and other groups. Last thing I want to focus on are the abolitionists, okay, and the ones that we need to know. William Lloyd Garrison, one of the most important ones, Frederick Douglass, and Sojourner Truth. William Lloyd Garrison was a radical abolitionist. He wanted to end slavery now. He became more radical as he grew older. He wrote The Liberator, and he was a strong proponent of abolition. Frederick Douglass was an African-American abolitionist as well, and I'll talk about him a little bit more in a minute. Okay, not all Northerners were abolitionists. I think this is an important point, okay, and some Northerners actually were against the abolitionists, okay, and so there was a reaction against some of the abolitionists, and a lot of them did not like William Lloyd Garrison because they thought he was just trying to create trouble. He was just trying to cause problems and conflict in the United States, and they had a problem with that. They wanted stability, and so some Northerners actually were against some of the abolitionists, okay. Now, the abolitionist methods, the biggest way to make changes, especially with Frederick Douglass, was political. Okay, and the abolitionists eventually start to form political parties, and we'll get more into these a little bit later in a push, but the biggest two parties, the Free Soil Party around 1846, 1848 was formed, prevent the spread of slavery, and the other abolitionist party is the Party of Lincoln. It eventually comes about in 1854, and that was the Republican Party. All right, there you go, beautiful people, A-Push scholars, fire up, work hard. Put some time into it, look at your terms, look at your keynotes, get ready for the test. I think you'll do fine, but put some effort, okay? Fire up.